Okay, so hi everybody and welcome to Vibe. Vibe Book and Music Shop is in Mui Wo on Lantau Island in Hong Kong. And today we've got a treat for you, something a bit different actually. So we've got Mr. Patrick Dransfield, who has just produced his first audiobook. In fact, that's a lie. I produced the first audiobook, but you wrote it. And also we have Mr. Alan Youngblood to accompany him on piano. So the audiobook, just to let you know, sort of took 27 days to record. We worked pretty hard on it, didn't we, over a 5-month period. 50 chapters, and it's all done and it's all available here on CD, on a 3 CD set. And Patrick is going to take you through some of the book and give you a kind of feel for what the book's about.
Thank you very much. So dear all, thanks for coming and thanks for tuning in for those who are on Facebook. And here we all are, live from Lantau. I'm very excited to introduce to you all my first novel, The Inner Circle Wu Xing, Book 1, Duel of the Sorcerers, which manifests itself currently as an audiobook produced, as Gary said, by Studio 114. During the next 30 minutes or so, we'll have a short, silent film contemporary to the period which the audiobook is set, which is around about 1917, and it's going to illustrate the music composed and performed by Alan Youngblood. Then a short reading, and finally a Q&A moderated by Vibe and Studio 114's very own, our host, Gary Brightman. The Duel of the Sorcerers is divided into two parts, the road from Liverpool and the road to Petrograd. And as these titles imply, the whole book is about a journey, or actually several journeys. As this image illustrates, and this is a combination of Brian, who's the designer of the book, Brian Chun, and also Chloe Frang, so it's their talents put together. And as it illustrates, one is a journey of Paul Tien Commode, a 22-year-old half Welsh, half Hakka Chinese trainee lawyer. We meet Paul as he sits rather bored at an old Chinese desk above his late parents' grocery shop in Liverpool's Chinatown in 1916, his loyal sheepdog Daffy at his feet, listlessly listening to an older Chinese uncle tell him about the mysterious disappearance of a battered paper Shanghai lantern. We, the listeners, follow Paul as events force him to leave his first inner circle of family, his mentor, Chinese-speaking Jesuit priest Father Xavier Pombo, and elder sister Sarah, on his physical journey to London and then to decadent, war-torn, German-controlled party city, Constantinople, then joining 1 million or more refugees in the then newly independent Ukraine, and finally, stripped of almost everything, into revolution-torn Petrograd. Paul's journey comes to a hiatus on the fateful date of Tuesday, April 17th, 1917, as Paul finally confronts his nemesis, the evil necromancer Gregory Gurdjieff. For Paul, it is a liminal journey from boyhood to manhood, and a spiritual journey as he realizes his special Chinese Hakka heritage as the guardian of the water element of the 5 Chinese elements, the Wu Xing. The Wu Xing both tether and bring harmony to the universe. He also learns that he can time surf. So through his mind, he can actually go through into different periods of time. And this is why I'm wearing the butterfly, because the butterfly is quite a big metaphor in the book, and it comes from Chuang Tzu, the idea that through transference of mind, you can either be the butterfly or you can be the man, right? And this is the kind of metaphor that's behind some of the parts of the book. And indeed, Book 1 is dedicated to the water element of the Wu Xing. And for me, the author, the duel has also proved to be quite a journey. All our journeys start with our mothers, and this one is dedicated to my own late mother, Pauline Dransfield, née Drake. She'd have been surprised, but gratified, I think, to see her poetic hero, Constantin Cavafy, appear as an incidental character in the book. Her favourite poem being, "When you set out on your way to Ithaca, you should hope that your journey is a long one, a journey full of adventure, full of knowing. Duel of the Sorcerers is also a book within a book, which also began on a journey, a long and boring coach journey. My late father Philip told me his version of Duel of the Sorcerers when I was 8, at the back of the coach in one of those interminable, smoke-filled saga tours of the early 1970s. These coach tours, this particular coach tour, was crisscrossing Austria. My dad was drawing on his prodigious memory and imagination as he embellished a penny dreadful novel called The Duel of the Sorcerers he had read when he was a lad of 15 in his high Pennines home in the 1930s. His loyal sheepdog Taffy, the original Daffy, at his side. Time served forward to 1972, and I can still see him, when I was 8, tamping his pipe as he paused, close to the climax of the story. And a voice in the seat further forward in the coach exclaimed, "For God's sake, man, go on. What happens next?" It turns out the whole coach had been listening. Duel has also been very much a Lantau story. COVID-19 required me in the early summer of 2020 to hole up in our small Hampton flat as our youngest son Jacob did home quarantine with his mum Carmen for 2 weeks. I started writing the first chapter in that strange summer. And I first got to know and work with Philip and with Gary Brightman in September 2021 when we presented a similar talk based on my photographic book, Track of Time, Moments of Transition. Little did Gary know that he would be spending more time than is healthy with me in a small room in Lantau. And at precisely 20 minutes in, which is about now, that time in September 2021, in walked Chloe Frang, the most talented book illustrator in the world, and she may be on the streaming, listening in from Germany at the moment, who was provided the stunning pictures that grace the cover and will be interspersed like diamonds in the rough during my presentation today. Finally, the Duel represents an intellectual and moral and spiritual journey. The book is dedicated to our 3 children, Liam Thomas Wei-An, Nicole Mary Wei-Yan, and Jacob Philip Wei-Hong. Jacob is in the corner there. Like Paul Alphonsius Sima Tien Commode and other characters in the book, Yi Ling Han and Simon Wigg, they have had to make their own inner circle of trusted family and friends as a community of English Viking hackers, or vackers, as Nikki says, is a small one. So the Inner Circle, Book 1, is also about the importance of finding people you can truly trust. And I feel I'm amongst members of people I can truly trust here. So thank you all for coming. And about the importance of tolerance in the fallen world of the 5 hegemons. There were dark forces in Western and Central Europe and China in 1917. The genocide perpetuated on the Hakka Chinese by the Qing forces in the 1860s was still in living memory. And the genesis of the Jewish Holocaust finds its roots in the 3 Pashas order that condoned the massacre of the Armenians. 2 revered reviewers of the book have both picked up on the dense historical research that leads to our current madman in the Kremlin having misinterpreted Ukrainian history, as 1917 was also the first year of an independent Ukraine. As Paul's mentor, Father Xavier Pombo, is fond of saying, if you are sincere and your quest is honourable, you will always find help, even in the least expected places. Through my own journey, learning about the mythologies of the I Ching, the Kabbalah, and Sufi mysticism, I have come to firmly believe in 2 things: that hope conquers all, and that the forces of light will always conquer the forces of darkness in the end. And to find out how, you'll have to pick up a copy or download the audiobook, and also wait patiently for the Inner Circle Book 2, Emperor Hongwu's Bright Mirror. In fact, truth be told, Duel is one long shaggy dog story. And as my elder brother Graham would say, we fear a sequel. God willing, 4 sequels actually, to match the 4 remaining elements of the Wu Xing: metal, fire, wood, and earth. And so to that movie clip I promised. It is an extract from the 1928 black and white French movie called The Fall of the House of Usher, directed by Jean Epstein and Louis Buñuel. This movie and several Eisenstein movies, particularly his cartoons for Ivan the Terrible Part 3, inspired the chapter Electric Shadows in Odessa, where Paul and his comrade at arms Nathan Hagen encounter the Jewish community of Tsarist Odessa. In this chapter they watch a Philip Glass-style multimedia performance. Actors, live Ukrainian folk musicians, Italian opera, and a raconteur, and only 2 out of 3 reels of a melodrama called Ratcliffe's Dream. The projectionist being based on Louis B. Mayer, the founder of MGM, who also started as a projectionist in Odessa. The clip also demonstrates the musical genius of Alan Youngblood and comprises the introductory music used throughout the audiobook. So, there we are. The longest chapter is called Matahari is Unwell, and the conspiracy that lies at the heart of the book is beginning to unravel as Paul Tien Commode is disguised as a Japanese banker, insinuating himself into the sinister group of characters that are plotting to bring down the fall of Tsarist Russia, financed by the Kaiser Wilhelm. The audio chapter is also a homage to Casablanca, with Oscars replacing Rick's as a jazz club that embraces all the flotsam and jetsam of war-torn Europe, including Contessa Luisa di Sancino da Stampa and her 2 pet cheetahs, Coriolanus and Perdita. Like many of the incidental characters in the Duel, the Contessa was a real person, a tired hedonist who knew Coco Chanel, developed a cocaine habit, and in the 1920s that must have taken some effort, I'm sure, and rented Dr. Axel Mump's palace on Capri until being thrown out, along with her other tired hedonists, for recreating the follies of that old fornicator, Emperor Tiberius. So imagine we are in Oscars, the coolest nightclub in the world, full of Dutch tourists, German bankers, and every chiseler known to man. A very clean-shaven, large, rather bulbous man in a sharp cream, double-breasted suit and long curling dark hair, a white ascension lily ostentatiously in his buttonhole, Oscar, evidently, tucked to the stage. I'm afraid that Matahari is unwell, but as sure as my name is Oscar, I'll always have a surprise or two up my sleeve for my beloved fellow aesthetes. Behind him, 3 coloured musicians took to the stage, a pianist, a double bass player and a drummer, all dressed in matching dark pinstripe suits and fedora hats. All the way from Alabama, Alabama Slim and the Mississippi Bluesman. The piano player, Alabama Slim, surveyed the audience and a silence descended. We were collectively moving into the musically unknown for Constantinople, or Liverpool for that matter. Slim said, "Me and the band, we've played some places in our time." You can tell who the inspiration is for this one, right? We and the band, we've played some places in our time, and let me tell you, you folks are the best looking. I promise you that me and the band are going to be doing our best tonight for you all. Now, my name is Alabama Slim, and we is going to introduce you all to something called the blues. I hope you like it, but as another Oscar, the original Oscar Wilde once said, in my hometown, Montgomery, Alabama, "Don't shoot me, I'm just the piano player." With a tinkle of the keys, the bass and the drum kicked in to a slow and fabulous new rhythm, and Constantinople got its first taste of the blues. Slim's lyrics were also sensational. I wrote them down on a napkin so I could one day send them to Nathan for his good friend, Constantine Cavafy, who I knew would appreciate the brevity, timelessness, and the deeper meaning behind the song. You may not have me all the time. You may never go my way. Mother Earth is laying for you because of all the debts you gotta pay. Don't care how great you are. Don't care what you're worth. When it all ends up, you gotta go back to Mother Earth. You may own half a city, even diamonds and pearls. You may buy that watch, baby, and that yacht, and sail around the world. Don't care how rich you are. Don't care what you're worth. When it all ends up, you gotta go back to Mother Earth. You may play racehorses. You may even own that racetrack. You may have enough money, baby, to buy anything you like. Don't care how great you are. Don't care what you're worth. When it all ends up, you gotta go back to Mother Earth. There we are. Salad, no, it's great. Have you got another tune for us?
From one of my second favorite movies. First one's The Godfather, just in case you want to know. Second one's actually Casablanca.
There we go.
Beautiful.
So if you can stand it, so can I.
If you could play it for her, you could play it for me.
I'm correct.
No, I forgot what to play.
Yeah, so we now go to Q&A. We've got a couple of questions that I think Gary's going to ask as the moderator, and then any question you guys have, a couple on Facebook that have come in. So there we go. Great.
Okay, so you can hear me all right. So one thing I realised that my questions are on the camera, which is also my phone, but I can get them on here, so don't worry too much. So first question is, how long did it take you to write this book, and what inspired you?
Okay. 2.5 years, I think. It really, of course, the book has got stuff in it which I've kind of referred to from my childhood and all sorts of things. So Stefan, who's here, taught me that actually a book which on the surface can seem quite different can be very personal. So it's actually a very personal book. But the genesis of it was really February 2020, because I'd ended up in London, ironically avoiding COVID, if you like, not avoiding it for me, but trying to organize a conference in Dubai. So I went there early. Nobody wanted to see me in London. So I ended up going to my old alma mater, the School of Oriental and African Studies, holed up and started researching, first of all, Greek mythology, because I didn't really know much about ancient Greek history. And then I thought, well, who's the equivalent in Chinese history? Because I'd studied modern Chinese history, but not the old stuff. So people like Sima Qian and all these people began to kind of manifest themselves. And so, yeah, really the origins were then. Also, I have to mention the book is dedicated to another friend of mine who sadly passed away, called Matthew Seligman. And what happened there was that on February that year, me and my elder brother Graham and he gathered together, and we all realized that we had a book in us, but it wasn't coming out. So we created something called the Failed Writers Guild, right? And I was kind of determined to kind of leave that club, really, and I'm still in it, well and truly. But he very unfortunately died in the first wave of COVID in the UK. And it was only when I was writing the very final dedication of the book, and obviously subconsciously I must have known, but the kind of way the I Ching works, it's not there, but for the actual story, there's various divinations that mean that Paul's life is being affected at various points in various ways. And April the 17th was always the darkest day, the double water day. And that's where you'll have to read the book, but that's where certain things happen. And that was actually the last day Matthew was around. Actually, that was when he passed away. So, yeah, so that was the genesis of it. Yeah.
All right. And also in the Inner Circle, there's a lot of music in there. What inspires you about the music?
Okay. So Bob Dylan is one of the inspirations behind a lot of it. And the reason I can't publish this book yet is I don't have a publisher, so that's a bit of an impediment. But also there's an awful lot of quotes in it, which would need to get permission. But Blonde on Blonde particularly is an inspiration towards this particular book. Because in a funny liminal sort of way, Dylan at that point just would sit down and write a song. And he actually wrote songs that he even forgotten. I mean, Joan Baez played something like 6 months later, which was Love is a 4-letter word. And he said, who wrote that? He said, you did. It was just pouring out of him after a motorcycle accident, which is kind of what happens to Paul Tian Commode. All of that instinctive stuff, which he could just do without even thinking, went. Right, and he had to reinvent himself. So that's one aspect to it.
Your Mother Earth. Oh, I was thinking, reminding me of Bob Dylan.
Oh, okay.
Other Bob Dylan in there.
Okay. Over the Rainbow, which we get up to a bit later on as well. Actually, the Ratcliffe's Dream is an opera from the German period of 1850s, and from there came the tune for Over the Rainbow. Right? So it's kind of interesting. And Howard Arlen and Yip Harburg wrote that. It's probably the most famous song of all. And it's a Kabbalah song. It's actually about finding freedom in your own mind if you're living in a really crap place, So that's also very important. And all of these, we might get onto mythologies in a bit. So all of these are linked mythologies. So Vishnu, the Indian god, I think played the first note. Maybe I'm getting this a bit wrong, but I know that in Indian mythology, music starts everything, right? And this is true for the Kabbalah, for the I Ching, even. I just recently found out. And, you know, Western philosophy, I mean, you had Bach and the harmony of the spheres and all this kind of thing. And it gets into color. So music, color, harmony of the universe all come into that. Then, of course, we can't go further without mentioning Alan's music. And I've mentioned to Alan, he's probably gone out for a fag. No, there he is. Okay. Okay. So I mentioned to Alan that I was doing this book and I needed some incidental music. And I hadn't realized Alan's depth of knowledge of film. And we both share a passion for Hitchcock and everything else like that. But also, there's a guy called Toro Takamatsu, who wrote the music. He was a classical composer in Japan, but he wrote the music for Kwaidan, which is a fantastic movie. And of course, Bernard Harmon, I think, is in there a little bit, you know, the guy who wrote the music to Psycho and all this. So I was absolutely bowled over when I got Alan's 4 tracks, because I just think they're brilliant, and they really, I think, fit with the book.
Okay, so these questions come from a guy called Richard Croft in the UK. He asks, what characters did you most enjoy writing about and why?
Okay. Kathleen Thompson comes up in the chapter Electric Shadows in Odessa, and for me she symbolises something about West Yorkshire and also Hakka women, because people associate women's emancipation perhaps with the 1940s, you know, where the men were fighting and so women, you know, were manning the factories and everything else like that, you know. But actually it starts much earlier, and I think earlier perhaps even than this, but in 1917, 1918, people like Agatha Christie were Red Cross volunteers driving trucks, all the rest of it. And Kathleen Thompson, who crops up as a very important character later on in the book, is based on Kathleen Royds. And she was a PhD doctor with a speciality in Coleridge. And she drove a Red Cross van across Ukraine at that time and organized all the refugee camps and everything else like that. And so you begin to find women asserting themselves. So that's one of the characters I particularly enjoy. And it reminds me also of my grandmother, Sally Drake, who, née Blackburn, who basically was the COO of the textile mill that my grandfather owned and ran. But she wouldn't have been called that, but she basically did all the books and all the organization behind the throne. So that was important to me. Another important one is Petrus Paraskitis, who is a Greek character. And I got my good friend Evangelos to actually do the voice for Petrus, which I'm not going to do for you now. You're very lucky on that one. But he's kind of like a free spirit from Crete. He's in his 70s. Reminds me of a guy who rowed us across from Dubrovnik to Lokrum, the island of Lokrum, when I was a kid with my parents. That was about 1972 again, right? And this character is one I really like. And he's a beekeeper, and he's kind of like one of these guys who's close to nature, close to earth. Yeah. So those are 2 characters I really enjoyed writing. I've got to also mention one other one, which is Simon Wigg, and he's also called Hunter Bowes. He's based on Boris Karloff, because Boris Karloff was around at this time. He was Anglo-Indian, and he went to Hollywood to become what we know as Boris Karloff, but he was from Windsor, I think, originally, right? So these characters crop up, and I like to play around with them.
Okay. I'm going to read the next question from the screen if
Oh,
you
okay,
allow
no problem.
me.
Yeah.
So Richard also asks, the world events you show us via the Lantern portal are very striking. Can you tell us about any world events that you're considering for your next book in the series and why they might have made such an impression on you?
Okay. So I've been trying to think about this, actually. And I'm going to take some questions from the floor in a minute, because it can't all be Richard's. But basically, if you've got any, if I've not droned you out. But basically, I'm going to probably... So time surfing is where people can move from one dimension to another. And I'm thinking of doing it in a double time thing. So the Northern Song, which is 11th century, which I consider to be one of the biggest Renaissance periods ever. So there's a guy called Xiaoyang who crops up in that, and also a Chinese poetess called Li Qing Zhao. One thing is that all these characters kind of, the inner circle means that these characters crop up again. So the guardian of the fire element in the first book is Li Ying Han. In the second book, it's going to be Li Qing Zhao, and she's actually a real person who wrote poetry in the Northern Song period. So yeah, and then we'll also have the end of the Qing and the Taiping Rebellion, and we'll get back to Liverpool in 1898.
Okay, so that's another 28 weeks of work for me.
There you go. So look forward to that. There you go.
Yeah, a couple more songs for you, Mr. Youngblood. Okay, so that's enough of Richard Croft's questions.
He could go on.
Oh, sorry, Richard. Sorry. So we're going to throw the questions to the floor now. Anybody got any questions for?
I do have a. Oh, sorry. No, you go ahead.
You first.
Okay, thank you. How much? I don't want to, get any spoiler or anything. But how much have you got ready in your mind about these 4 sequels? Have you managed to write the whole canvas until the end, or are you making?
I had the
it
same
up
question,
as you go?
less eloquent, but the same question.
Ah, well, there you go. There you go.
I've got the titles. So the next one is Emperor Hongwu's Bright Mirror, and that's the water to wood element. So these things change. So the African Queen is number 3. If there's anything original about any of this, it's that, well, not particularly original, but I believe that if a cosmology is a cosmology, it is a universal cosmology. So Chinese cosmology now is mine. I'm having it. And so it's actually the Queen of Sheba's descendant who is the star of number 3, the African Queen. Book 4, The Leaving of Liverpool Again, Earth to Metal. And then book 5, which I'm quite looking forward to, and I've kind of got more ideas for book 5 than I have the others, but Brave New World is book 5, where, you'll have to find out, and I will too. But yeah, have I worked them all out? Not at all, but occasionally kind of like scenes and characters begin to manifest, and there we are.
Okay. Anybody else got a question? Jane. Just me.
Did you consider using the real names of the people that you've mentioned, and what do you think is going to keep your reader reading?
Oh, okay, there you go. There's a real mixture. There's a glossary in the back of the book, also on the website, which, because there's quite a lot of historical research, I thought, well, I better show it off, right? So it's all there. And quite a few of the characters who are incidental characters are based on real people. The protagonist, Paul isn't. The Jesuit priest isn't. Various other people are. But Winston Churchill, I think we can say, is a kind of interesting character who's in the book as well. So that's a very good question, actually, Jane, because what works for this book, if it works at all, is that there's a very linear plot. There's lots of things going on, but actually it's very specific to a set of actually quite well-researched historical events. So you've got a spy kind of narrative going to a denouement at the end. How I do that with the other books, I've got to work out. So, yeah. So I don't know. Let's hope that they like what they've read and get sucked into all the mythology and everything else. Let's hope that works.
Okay, thanks, Jane.
Oh, no, yeah, go on.
How disciplined are you as a writer? Do you say I'm going to write between these hours and those hours? And how many pages a day do you aim to produce? Or does it not work out that way consistently?
Okay. That's a very good question. I think I'm a bit like Georges Simenon, which is basically there's a long period of me doing research and whatever, and then a relatively intense period of writing, which I have to do. And I've got to be in a certain frame of mind. So actually, Richard asked another question, which, I'm not going to go into all these questions, but I have a notebook next to me. So most of the inspirations that I get are kind of like in that kind of 6 o'clock in the morning kind of time. So I'll write whatever, and scenes have come to me from that and things like that. So one of the scenes that's coming for the next book is a Korean guy who is which element is he? He's the wood element. And basically a samurai type guy, like Redbeard in the Kurosawa movies. And he's watching as the last Ming emperor runs round the back of the Forbidden City and hangs himself. That's the first scene. And it kind of thinks, I think about it like a bit like a Western type of movie, right? You know, can you imagine Clint Eastwood being a bit like this guy, you know? So, yeah. But there's a lot of research, and then when I'm kind of ready, I'll throw myself in. I don't do, I mean, of course, I do rewriting as we go, and the audiobook has been a great discipline for that, because I've changed the ending and I've moved things around because of having to read the whole thing. But once I write something, it's kind of like 90% of what's going to be there, so I've got to be ready, otherwise it's crap. You know.
Okay.
Oh, yep, great.
Do you think it's entirely coincidence that places you mentioned like Odessa are much more in consciousness in many places than they probably were in 2020?
Yeah, it's a very strange thing, because obviously my research into all of this was like 18 months ago. And, you know, Catherine Royd and all of these people I had no consciousness of. And the history has been quite interesting to try and unravel. One of the facts that is perhaps lesser known, and there's lots of different sources, but Vladimir Lenin, was actually in Ukraine in 1914 with his wife, funded by the Germans, to actually bring about the independence of Ukraine. So when we hear this strange history, kind of, you know, Ersatz history coming out of Russia at the moment, it's not based on any real facts, you know. And but yeah, it's been a bit spooky, to be honest. You know, there's a book I think called A Million People on Foot, which is about that experience in Ukraine in 1917, and now we've got maybe 5 or 6 million people on foot. You know, so it has been very chilling, actually, to be honest. Yeah, and Odessa, I mean, there was 300,000 people, Jewish people, living in Odessa in 1917. I think there's maybe 3,000 people living in Odessa today. So it shows, you know, what history has been, right? You know.
Okay, we've got time for just 2 more questions.
I've got a loud voice.
Yeah.
What are we looking at this picture behind you, and what's the
Relationship with the book.
Oh, very cool. I'm glad you asked that. Okay, I'm very glad you asked that. This is when I realized me and Chloe were definitely on the same wavelength, actually, because these are the 5 elements around the outside. These, as you probably recognize, are the 10, and I'm going to mispronounce it, but they're the 10 serots, which are Hebrew characters, okay? And then this represents, and Chloe was responsible for coming up with this idea, but Einstein and kind of physics, right? And so the underlying philosophies behind the book are everything to some degree, but they are about a synthesis of the Kabbalah, the Wu Xing, the I Ching, and also, if you like, science. Because in 1916, Einstein had just published in German in Vienna, the what became E equals mc squared. He just published that. So 1916 was a very special time. And the idea behind the story, actually, I've kind of been tripped up a little bit by real facts. One thing, when I knew I was on the right track with this book, was that I had the nemesis, this guy called Gurdjieff, who wants to destroy the universe for his own purposes. He said, a rain of fire is going to come down. This is January 1916. I thought, okay, I've written that. What's this rain of fire? And I'd done research in London, and I knew that there were Zeppelin raids. So I thought, well, it's a Zeppelin raid, right? And so therefore, I just researched Zeppelin raids, and there was a planned Zeppelin raid for January 1916. So I thought, okay, history before the fact. The reason I mention that is that in Kaifeng, in northern Song dynasty, there was Persian Jewish people making a kind of, community, and they're still there. People descended from those first people. So my idea in the book was they go to Constantinople, and this book in the middle, which is the Duel of the Sorcerers, has got secret runes in it, right? So it's got a combination, a collaboration of all the secret spells you could possibly imagine. And the idea in the book was this was somehow smuggled to the Chinese Jews and then found by the Jesuits and everything else. at the time, I thought that was total rubbish. I mean, just made it up, right? But funnily enough, I've been doing research into the Jesuits in 1600s, 1670, 1680. There's a guy called Bouvet, and he was a figurist. And what the figurists were about was they were Jesuits, they were priests, they had to be on the right side of the Catholic Church. And they're confronted with a culture which is older and more sophisticated than their own. So what was the conclusion? It came from Middle East and Europe, it must have done. So they invented this figurist thing where God has inserted his own secret language, the lawmakers, right? He's inserted this into the kind of I Ching and all this sort of stuff. They couldn't have China have a culture that was independent, so they made this figurist stuff up. And they also talked about the Jewish community in Kaifeng. So I thought, I'm making this stuff up and they're making this stuff up.
Okay.
What's in the middle?
Oh, the middle is the plot of the Duel of the Sorcerers. I think I referred to it with my dad's story, which is actually this penny dreadful ghost story. Being kind of from Yorkshire, we are obsessed with ghost stories. And this story is played out through this penny dreadful book that Paul is reading, where there's this dark nemesis guy who actually murders this is the good wizard, and this is a guy called Amrak Clig, who is the dark nemesis guy, and he's paralleled with the villain in the piece, who's called Gregory Gurdjieff.
Okay, last question goes to Steve.
No, I have the same question.
No, okay,
Yeah,
all right.
thank you, Doc.
So, anybody else? Last question.
You got one now?
Okay,
Oh.
so, well, it remains for me to say what a brilliant, engaging talk,
Thank you.
Patrick, and thank you very much. And also that the CDs are on sale today, $300, as is Patrick's previous book, Track of Time, Moments in Transition, which is about his photography in Beijing and China in the 80s, 1980s.
Yeah, that's right, very good. Yeah.
Okay, everyone, thank you very much.
Thank you.